Elizabeth Tudor entered the world on September 7, 1533, at Greenwich Palace, surrounded by ceremony, expectation, and political tension. Her birth was not simply a private family event. It was a matter of national importance. Her father, King Henry VIII, had spent years trying to secure a legitimate male heir. His first marriage, to Catherine of Aragon, had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. Henry feared that a woman might not be able to hold the English throne without inviting rebellion, foreign interference, or civil war. England was still haunted by memories of the Wars of the Roses, when rival noble families had fought for control of the crown. Henry believed the future of his dynasty depended on a son. To marry Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, he had challenged the authority of the Pope, ended his marriage to Catherine, and pushed England toward a historic break with the Roman Catholic Church, and had become the center of a political and religious revolution. Many at court believed that the child she carried would justify every risk Henry had taken. When the baby was born, however, she was a girl. The official celebrations continued. Elizabeth received a magnificent christening, and royal officials proclaimed her a legitimate princess. But behind the public ceremony was unmistakable disappointment. The birth of a daughter did not solve Henry's succession problem, and still had time to produce a son, but her position was now more fragile than it appeared. Elizabeth could not have understood the danger surrounding her. As an infant, she was placed in her own household at Hatfield, away from the daily life of her parents. This was normal for a royal child. She was attended by servants, nurses, tutors, and officials responsible for every detail of her upbringing. Her older half-sister Mary was also forced to serve in Elizabeth's household for a time. Mary had once been treated as England's legitimate heir. Now she was expected to recognize the infant daughter of Anne Boleyn as the king's true princess. The arrangement was emotionally cruel and politically calculated. Mary refused to accept that her parents' marriage had been invalid. She also refused to acknowledge herself as illegitimate. Her resistance angered Henry, who separated her from Catherine of Aragon and placed enormous pressure on both mother and daughter. Elizabeth's earliest years were therefore shaped by a family already divided by legitimacy, religion, and royal power. Before she could speak, her existence had become proof of one woman's triumph and another woman's humiliation. Yet Anne Boleyn's victory did not last. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne suffered failed pregnancies. Henry's attention began to move toward another woman at court, Jane Seymour. At the same time, Anne accumulated enemies among conservative nobles, religious opponents, and courtiers who had once supported her rise. In the spring of 1536, the Queen was arrested. Anne was accused of adultery with several men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. She was also accused of plotting the king's death. Modern historians continue to question the credibility of these accusations. The evidence was weak, and some of the alleged crimes could not have occurred on the dates presented. But in Henry VIII's court, evidence mattered less than royal will, and was taken to the Tower of London, placed on trial, and found guilty. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by sword inside the Tower grounds. Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old. There is no reliable record of how or when she learned that her mother had died. She was too young to understand the charges, the trial, or the political machinery that had destroyed Anne. But the consequences were immediate. The marriage between Henry and Anne was declared invalid. Elizabeth lost her title as princess and was officially labeled illegitimate. The child whose birth had once been celebrated with royal pageantry was now addressed simply as Lady Elizabeth. Her household noticed the change. Money became a problem. Her governess, Lady Margaret Bryan, wrote that Elizabeth had outgrown her clothes and lacked proper garments. The letter revealed the strange reality of Elizabeth's new position. She was still the daughter of the king, surrounded by royal servants and raised in a royal residence, but no one seemed certain how she should be treated. She was important but not secure. Henry married Jane Seymour only days after Anne's execution. In 1537, Jane gave birth to the son Henry had wanted for so long, Edward. Elizabeth was now pushed farther from the center of the succession. Her younger half-brother became the unquestioned heir to the throne. Bells rang across England, celebrations filled the streets, and the king's dynasty appeared safe at last. Jane Seymour died shortly after childbirth, leaving Edward without a mother. Elizabeth, Mary, and Edward would all grow up carrying different forms of maternal loss. Mary had been separated from Catherine before her death. Elizabeth's mother had been executed. Edward's mother had died after giving birth to him. The royal children were united by blood, but their positions remained dangerously unequal. Elizabeth's childhood continued through Henry's later marriages. Anne of Cleves arrived and departed. Catherine Howard became queen while still very young, only to be arrested and executed in 1542. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, eventually brought a measure of stability to the royal family. Each marriage taught Elizabeth something about the vulnerability of women near the throne. A queen could be praised, painted, richly dressed, and publicly honored, yet still be abandoned or destroyed when she no longer satisfied the king. Marriage at the highest level of society was not simply about affection. It was tied to inheritance, diplomacy, religion, fertility, and survival. Elizabeth also began to recognize the danger of emotional exposure. Those who showed anger could be accused of disobedience. Those who trusted the wrong person could be betrayed. Those who spoke too freely could have their words repeated before the king. Court life rewarded careful observation and controlled speech. Fortunately, Elizabeth possessed an exceptional mind. She received the education of a Renaissance prince rather than the limited instruction often provided to girls. She studied Latin, Greek, French, Italian, history, theology, philosophy, and classical literature. Her tutors included some of the finest scholars in England. Elizabeth learned to translate complex texts and communicate with precision. She became skilled at understanding how language could conceal as much as it revealed. This was not merely academic training. In the Tudor court, words could protect a person or condemn one. Her education also gave her a sense of identity separate from her uncertain legal status. She might no longer be called a princess, but she could become intellectually formidable. She could prepare herself for a future no one could predict. Catherine Parr encouraged Elizabeth's studies and helped restore a sense of family among Henry's children. Under Catherine's influence, Elizabeth experienced a period of relative calm. She participated in court life, exchanged scholarly translations, and developed the disciplined public image that would later define her reign. But even during these quieter years, she could never forget the speed with which royal favor changed. Her father had loved Anne Boleyn before ordering her execution. He had welcomed Catherine Howard before sending her to the same fate. Advisors, nobles, and servants rose rapidly and disappeared just as quickly. Elizabeth was learning the central lesson of her childhood. Safety was never permanent. By the time Henry VIII died in January 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old. She was intelligent, highly educated, and outwardly composed. But beneath that discipline was a child shaped by absence and uncertainty. Her mother had been executed. Her legitimacy had been erased. Her place in the royal family had changed repeatedly. And now, with her father dead and her 9-year-old brother Edward becoming king, Elizabeth was about to enter a new world of ambitious guardians, political conspiracies, and dangerous attention. The first great threat of her life had come from being Anne Boleyn's daughter. The next would come from a man who believed the teenage Elizabeth could bring him closer to the throne. When King Henry VIII died in January 1547, his 13-year-old daughter Elizabeth entered a new and uncertain phase of her life. Her 9-year-old half-brother became King Edward VI, but England was not truly ruled by a child. Power passed into the hands of ambitious noblemen who claimed to govern in Edward's name. At the center of the new government stood Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the young king's maternal uncle and Lord Protector of England. For Elizabeth, Henry's death brought both opportunity and danger. She had been restored to the line of succession by an Act of Parliament, placed after Edward and her older half-sister Mary. Yet she was still legally illegitimate. She was close enough to the crown to attract attention, but not powerful enough to protect herself from those who might use her position for their own advancement. Elizabeth went to live with Henry's widow, Catherine Parr. Catherine had been the closest thing Elizabeth had known to a stable maternal figure. Intelligent, educated, and sympathetic to Protestant reform, she encouraged Elizabeth's studies and treated her with affection. Under Catherine's guidance, the teenage princess continued learning languages, theology, history, and classical literature. For a brief period, Elizabeth's future appeared peaceful. That peace ended when Catherine married Thomas Seymour. Thomas was the younger brother of the Lord Protector and an uncle to King Edward. He was charming, physically confident, politically ambitious, and deeply resentful of his brother's greater authority. He held the title of Lord High Admiral, but he wanted more power than the government was willing to give him. Marriage to Catherine Parr brought Thomas into close contact with Elizabeth. The princess was now 14 years old. By the standards of the Tudor court, she was approaching marriageable age, and her place in the succession made her one of the most valuable young women in Europe. Thomas began behaving toward her with a familiarity that soon became disturbing. Accounts from Elizabeth's household described him entering her bedroom early in the morning, sometimes before she was fully dressed. He teased her, struck her playfully, and engaged in behavior that her governess, Catherine Ashley, eventually considered inappropriate. On at least one occasion, Catherine Parr reportedly joined in a playful encounter, helping Thomas hold Elizabeth while he cut her black gown into pieces. The precise meaning of these incidents has been debated for centuries. Some may initially have appeared as rough household games, but the pattern became increasingly troubling. Elizabeth was a teenager living under the authority of adults. Thomas Seymour was an experienced man in his late 30s, a senior nobleman, and the husband of her guardian. Whatever Elizabeth privately felt, she had little freedom to confront him directly. Her survival depended on restraint. At first, Catherine seemed to tolerate or misunderstand her husband's behavior. Eventually, however, she recognized the risk. Elizabeth was removed from the household in the spring of 1548 and sent to live at Cheshunt with Anthony Denny and his family. The separation was painful. Elizabeth wrote to Catherine with apparent affection, regretting that circumstances had forced them apart. Yet behind the polite language stood a serious warning. Rumors involving a princess could become politically explosive. Even an innocent relationship could be transformed into evidence of immorality, treason, or a secret plan for marriage. Several months later, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter. She died soon afterward, probably from complications related to childbirth. Elizabeth was 15. Once again, a woman who had offered her security disappeared suddenly from her life. Catherine's death also removed the main barrier between Thomas Seymour and Elizabeth. Soon, rumors spread that Thomas intended to marry the princess. Such a marriage would have given him a direct connection to the succession and possibly enormous influence over the future of the monarchy. Thomas had already demonstrated a willingness to operate outside lawful authority. He tried to build a personal relationship with the young king, slipping Edward money and attempting to turn him against the Lord Protector. He cultivated servants, sought political allies, and complained that his brother had unfairly excluded him from power. By early 1549, the government viewed him as a threat. Thomas was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Investigators searched his property and examined his correspondence. Their attention quickly turned toward Elizabeth. The questions were dangerous. Had Thomas Seymour intended to marry her? Had Elizabeth agreed? Had her servants carried secret messages? Had there been private meetings? Was there a conspiracy to place Thomas in control of the princess and perhaps, eventually, the kingdom? Elizabeth's governess, Catherine Ashley, and her financial officer, Thomas Parry, were arrested and interrogated. Under pressure, they admitted that discussions of marriage had occurred. Investigators tried to prove that Elizabeth herself had knowingly participated in an unlawful plan. At 15, she faced the machinery of Tudor political investigation. She knew what such accusations could mean. Her mother had been convicted of adultery and treason after a trial built around questionable evidence. Catherine Howard had been destroyed partly because servants and acquaintances revealed details of her private life. Elizabeth had learned that the behavior of people around a royal woman could be used against her, even when she did not control it. Her interrogator was Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, an experienced court official sent to question her and observe her household. He expected to find a frightened girl who could be pressured into confession. Instead, he encountered someone already skilled in the art of political survival. Elizabeth denied agreeing to marry Thomas Seymour. She demanded to know the precise accusations against her. She carefully separated what she knew from what her servants might have discussed. She refused to accept responsibility for words spoken by others. Her answers were cautious without appearing openly defiant. She understood that silence alone could look suspicious, but saying too much could create contradictions. She therefore responded with controlled precision. She admitted only what could not safely be denied, rejected speculation, and avoided giving investigators the confession they wanted. Tyrwhitt became frustrated. In a letter to the Lord Protector, he remarked that Elizabeth possessed a strong mind and would not reveal more than she chose to reveal. That observation captured a quality that would later define her reign. Elizabeth had learned to survive by controlling information. She also understood the importance of reputation. Rumors about her conduct were spreading through the court, and she feared that silence from the government would make them appear true. In one remarkable letter, she asked the Lord Protector and his council to issue a public statement defending her honor. Elizabeth did not merely claim innocence. She recognized that political truth depended partly on what the public was allowed to believe. She wrote that malicious rumors could damage her name even without evidence. She wanted the government to confront the scandal openly rather than allow uncertainty to grow. It was an unusually confident request from a 15-year-old girl under investigation. Yet it also revealed fear. Elizabeth knew that a damaged reputation could destroy her marriage prospects, weaken her place in the succession, and give her enemies a permanent weapon. In Tudor England, a royal woman's personal behavior was treated as a matter of state security. Questions about sexuality, marriage, and legitimacy were inseparable from questions about inheritance and power. Thomas Seymour never received a public trial. Parliament condemned him through an Act of Attainder, a legal process that allowed the government to declare a person guilty without the protections of an ordinary court proceeding. He was executed for treason on March 20, 1549. Elizabeth reportedly responded to the news with a controlled observation. "This day died a man of much wit and very little judgment." Whether those exact words were hers remains uncertain, but the statement suited the image she had already begun to construct: intelligent, restrained, and unwilling to reveal private emotion. Behind that composure, however, the Seymour affair left lasting damage. Elizabeth had experienced inappropriate attention from a powerful man. She had been separated from another mother figure. Her closest servants had been imprisoned and interrogated. Her name had been connected to a treason investigation. For weeks, she could not know whether a confession from someone else might lead to her own arrest. The scandal taught her that intimacy was dangerous. Marriage could be used as a path to power. Affection could hide ambition. Members of a household could become witnesses. Private jokes could be transformed into evidence. Even trusted servants might reveal secrets when threatened with imprisonment. Elizabeth became more guarded after the investigation. She demanded greater discipline from those around her and grew increasingly aware that every friendship had political consequences. The experience may also have influenced her later refusal to marry. As queen, she would use the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, negotiating with foreign princes while avoiding a final commitment. She understood that a husband could become a rival center of authority. She had watched Thomas Seymour attempt to gain political power through proximity to the royal family, and she had nearly been drawn into his destruction. But the danger surrounding Elizabeth was not over. King Edward VI's health began to fail. The Protestant government feared that if he died without children, the throne would pass to Mary, a devoted Catholic. Powerful men at court began planning to prevent that succession. Elizabeth once again found herself near the center of a struggle she did not control. In July 1553, Edward died at the age of 15. For several tense days, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen as part of an attempt to keep England Protestant. The plan collapsed when Mary gathered widespread support and seized the throne. Elizabeth publicly joined her sister's triumphal entry into London. Crowds celebrated the daughters of Henry VIII, believing the lawful succession had been restored. But the unity between the sisters would not last. Mary's determination to return England to Catholicism placed the Protestant Elizabeth under immediate suspicion. Every rebellion against the new queen would make Elizabeth appear more dangerous. Every conspirator who mentioned her name could place her life at risk. The Seymour investigation had taught Elizabeth how to survive questioning. Soon, she would need that skill again, this time not in the security of a country residence, but within the stone walls of the Tower of London, where her mother had waited for death. When Mary Tudor became queen in July 1553, Elizabeth rode beside her through the streets of London as crowds celebrated the return of Henry VIII's daughters. For a brief moment, the sisters appeared united. Mary had survived years of humiliation under their father. She had been declared illegitimate, separated from her mother, and pressured to reject the Catholic faith that defined her identity. Elizabeth understood much of that pain. Both women had grown up in the same dangerous dynasty, although their experiences had shaped them in very different ways. Mary emerged from childhood with an intense devotion to Catholicism and a determination to restore what her father had destroyed. Elizabeth had been educated within the Protestant movement and was closely associated with reformers who had gained power during Edward VI's reign. Religion was not merely a private matter in 16th century England. It determined loyalty, law, diplomacy, and the legitimacy of rulers. A person's beliefs could influence whether they were trusted, imprisoned, or executed. Elizabeth therefore entered Mary's reign in a precarious position. She was the Queen's half-sister and next in line to the throne. She was also the most visible Protestant figure in the royal family. At first, Elizabeth behaved carefully. She attended Catholic services when required and avoided openly challenging Mary's policies. Yet outward obedience could not erase suspicion. Protestant nobles, foreign diplomats, and dissatisfied courtiers viewed Elizabeth as a possible alternative to the Queen. Mary's proposed marriage to Prince Philip of Spain deepened the crisis. Many English subjects feared that the marriage would place the country under foreign influence. They worried that Spanish advisors would control the government, that England would become involved in continental wars, and that Philip might dominate Mary politically. In early 1554, rebellion erupted. The most serious uprising was led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in Kent. Wyatt gathered armed supporters and marched toward London, claiming that he intended to prevent the Spanish marriage. Some conspirators discussed replacing Mary with Elizabeth and arranging Elizabeth's marriage to Edward Courtenay, another descendant of royal blood. Whether Elizabeth knew the full details of the plot remains uncertain. No conclusive evidence proved that she had participated. But in Tudor politics, suspicion could be almost as dangerous as guilt. Mary's government ordered Elizabeth to come to court. At the time, Elizabeth was staying at Ashridge and claimed to be seriously ill. Royal physicians were sent to examine her, and guards were instructed to escort her to London. She traveled slowly through the winter weather, weak enough that she had to stop frequently. When Elizabeth entered the capital, the rebellion had already collapsed. Wyatt had been captured, and prisoners were being questioned. The atmosphere was filled with fear. Executions followed. Bodies were displayed as warnings. Investigators searched for evidence connecting Elizabeth to the conspiracy. Letters were examined, servants were interrogated, and rumors spread through the court. Elizabeth denied involvement. She wrote directly to Mary, insisting that she had never participated in any plan against her. The letter showed the same caution she had demonstrated during the Thomas Seymour investigation. Elizabeth defended herself firmly but avoided language that could be interpreted as a challenge to the Queen. Her appeal did not save her from imprisonment. On March 18, 1554, Elizabeth was taken by boat along the River Thames to the Tower of London. The Tower was more than a prison. It was a symbol of royal authority and political death. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been imprisoned there before her execution. Other queens, nobles, and alleged traitors had passed through its gates and never returned. According to later accounts, Elizabeth initially resisted leaving the boat. Rain fell as guards waited to take her inside. She knew that prisoners accused of treason often entered through the Watergate, traditionally known as Traitor's Gate. Elizabeth was only 20 years old. As she stepped onto the wet stones, she had no guarantee that she would ever leave alive. Inside the tower, her movements were restricted and her servants were carefully controlled. Guards watched her. Messages were monitored. She was separated from reliable information about events outside. The uncertainty was deliberate. Political imprisonment did not depend only on physical discomfort. Fear itself was a weapon. A prisoner might hear footsteps in a corridor and wonder whether officials were bringing another set of questions, or an order for execution. Elizabeth had reason to expect the worst. Lady Jane Grey had already been executed after Wyatt's rebellion, despite having once been spared. Mary's advisors argued that leaving rival claimants alive invited further conspiracies. Wyatt himself was pressured to provide evidence against Elizabeth. At one point, reports circulated that he had accused her. Before his execution, however, Wyatt publicly stated that Elizabeth had not known of the rebellion. The government still did not trust her. Interrogators questioned Elizabeth about letters, conversations, and invitations connected to the rebels. She continued to deny any knowledge of treason. Once again, she refused to speculate or confess merely to satisfy those questioning her. She had spent her childhood learning that careless words could become permanent evidence. Her survival now depended on that lesson. Mary faced a difficult decision. Elizabeth was dangerous because of what she represented, but executing the daughter of Henry VIII without clear proof could provoke anger throughout England. Elizabeth was popular among many Protestants, and even some Catholics believed she should not be condemned without evidence. Foreign diplomats also watched closely. The succession of the English throne affected the balance of power across Europe. After approximately 2 months, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, but she was not free. She was transferred under guard to Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire. Sir Henry Bedingfield was placed in charge of her, and his presence became a constant reminder that she remained a prisoner in everything but name. Elizabeth reportedly feared Bedingfield and suspected that he might eventually receive secret orders to kill her. Whether that fear was justified, it reflected the reality of her world. Royal prisoners did not always receive public trials. An unexpected illness, an isolated residence, or an obedient official could remove a political problem quietly. At Woodstock, Elizabeth spent her days reading, writing, walking when permitted, and waiting. Waiting had become one of her greatest political skills. She could not command an army. She could not challenge Mary openly. She could not escape England without appearing guilty. Her only realistic strategy was to remain patient, avoid provocation, and survive longer than the crisis surrounding her. Over time, restrictions eased. Elizabeth was eventually allowed to leave Woodstock and return to one of her residences, but she remained under observation. Mary's reign became increasingly troubled. The restoration of Catholicism led to the persecution of Protestant reformers. Hundreds were burned for heresy, creating a legacy that would later earn Mary the name Bloody Mary. The Queen believed she was defending religious truth and rescuing the souls of her subjects, but the executions strengthened Protestant resistance and damaged her reputation. Mary's marriage to Philip also failed to provide the political stability she had hoped for. She desperately wanted a child. A successful pregnancy would have created a Catholic heir and removed Elizabeth from the center of the succession. In 1555, Mary appeared to be pregnant. Her abdomen expanded, and preparations were made for a royal birth. No child came. The episode was probably a false pregnancy, possibly influenced by illness. For Mary, the personal and political humiliation was devastating. For Elizabeth, it meant that she remained the likely future queen. The relationship between the sisters became even more strained. Mary could not easily trust Elizabeth, but she could not legally remove her without stronger grounds. Elizabeth continued to present herself as obedient. She avoided becoming the public leader of the Protestant opposition, even though many already looked to her as their hope for the future. This restraint was crucial. Had Elizabeth encouraged rebellion, she might have justified Mary's fears. Had she fled abroad, she could have become the center of a foreign-backed invasion. Instead, she remained in England, maintained her innocence, and allowed time to weaken her enemies. By 1558, Mary's health was failing. England had suffered the loss of Calais, its last major possession in France. The Queen was childless, physically ill, and increasingly isolated. Her government could no longer avoid the question of succession. Elizabeth was at Hatfield when news arrived that Mary had died on November 17, 1558. Tradition holds that Elizabeth was sitting beneath an oak tree when messengers brought her the announcement. Whether the scene occurred exactly as later described is uncertain, but its symbolism endured. The girl who had been declared illegitimate was now Queen of England. Elizabeth was 25 years old. She had survived the execution of her mother, the rejection of her father, the dangers of the Seymour scandal, religious conflict, interrogation, imprisonment, and years of suspicion. Many people who had once appeared more powerful than she was were now dead. Her childhood had not prepared her for a peaceful life. It had prepared her to rule in a world where loyalty could change overnight. The qualities that later defined Elizabeth's monarchy had already been formed. She distrusted permanent commitments because she had seen promises broken. She controlled access to her private emotions because vulnerability had repeatedly placed her in danger. She delayed decisions because time had often been her greatest protection. She used ambiguous language because direct answers could trap a ruler as easily as they could trap a prisoner. Her famous refusal to marry was also rooted in experience. Elizabeth had watched royal marriages create humiliation, religious conflict, and political dependency. Her mother had risen through marriage and died because the king wanted a different future. Catherine Howard had been executed after becoming queen. Catherine Parr's marriage to Thomas Seymour had placed Elizabeth in danger. Mary's Spanish marriage had helped provoke rebellion. As queen, Elizabeth would negotiate marriage proposals for years, using them to influence foreign policy without surrendering control to a husband. She had learned that marriage could give a man legal and political power over a woman, even when that woman wore a crown. Her religious policies also reflected the dangers of her youth. Elizabeth was Protestant, but she understood that extreme persecution could destabilize the kingdom. She sought a religious settlement that would restore Protestant government while allowing some outward conformity from subjects who privately remained Catholic. The settlement did not end religious conflict, and her reign would later include severe persecution of Catholics, especially when international tensions and assassination plots increased. Yet Elizabeth initially presented her policy as a search for national unity rather than personal vengeance. She had witnessed what happened when rulers allowed private belief to become an endless test of political loyalty. On January 15, 1559, Elizabeth was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were decorated for her procession. Crowds gathered to see the new queen, offering gifts, speeches, and public celebrations. Elizabeth responded with warmth and theatrical skill. She listened, smiled, spoke to ordinary people, and presented herself as a ruler connected to the nation. It was a carefully managed performance. Elizabeth understood that monarchy depended on perception. She had once asked the government to defend her reputation during the Seymour scandal. Now, as queen, she would build one of the most powerful public images in European history. Portraits showed her covered in pearls, jewels, and symbols of authority. Speeches presented her as both a woman and a ruler capable of masculine courage. Court celebrations transformed her into the Virgin Queen, married not to a man but to England itself. Behind the symbolism remained the frightened child of the Tudor court. The queen who demanded loyalty had grown up surrounded by betrayal. The ruler who hesitated before making irreversible decisions had learned that a single order could send someone to the scaffold. The woman who hid her aging face behind increasingly elaborate portraits had spent her life understanding that appearances shaped political reality. Elizabeth's childhood did not guarantee that she would become a successful monarch. Could easily have broken her. Instead, it gave her a set of survival skills unusually suited to the dangerous world she inherited. She had learned to watch before speaking, to wait before acting, to reveal only what was necessary, and above all, to remain alive when powerful people expected her to disappear. When Elizabeth became queen, England did not receive an innocent young woman untouched by politics. It received a survivor who had already spent more than 2 decades studying fear, ambition, religion, and power from the most dangerous position imaginable. Close enough to the throne to be useful, but never secure enough to feel safe. The dangers of her childhood did not remain in the past. They became the foundation of her rule.